If one were to ask a theologian, church historian, and many church leaders on how to explain Matthew chapter 24 and its parallels in Mark and Luke, they would say that the chapter is not to be understood in its literal understanding, but interpreted. This because of things that appear to have fulfilled themselves in the 1st century AD, 35-40 years after Jesus prophesied them. Things like the Second Temple of Jerusalem that was destroyed during the siege of Jerusalem in 66-70 AD, and that the chapter speaks basically of that very troubled later half of the 1st century AD prophesied by Jesus 35-40 years before. And what Jesus prophesied in Matthew chapter 24 were the troubles and persecutions of the early church both before and after the siege. The siege of Jerusalem appears to be verses 16 to 28, with verse 29 interpreted as something totally symbolic, referring to the siege and its effects on neighboring nations and peoples. Verse 15, Titus' abomination of desolation of the Second Temple of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Titus' abomination of desolation of the Second Temple of Jerusalem would find its fulfillment also in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. With Titus, the son of perdition, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. Matthew chapter 24 is believed to be past history. The chapter mostly fulfilled in the later half of the 1st century AD. Verses 15 to 28, the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans. Verses 4 to 14, troubles and persecutions of the early church before the siege of Jerusalem, during and after the siege. And the chapter, when it comes to the timing, from Jesus' words, Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, KJV, Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Where Jesus appears to be speaking of his generation at the time of his preachings, the 1st century AD generation. The problem with having Matthew chapter 24 mostly fulfilled in the 1st century AD is verses 30 to 31, which, as we all know, was obviously not fulfilled in the 1st century AD, and since then, and after 2,000 years, the second coming of Jesus Christ has still to come. For how impossible it would appear, there are many in church that believe that verse 30-31 was fulfilled in the 1st century AD with Jesus' second coming, verse 30-31, not understood in its literal meaning, but interpreted under a spiritual interpretation. Jesus' second coming, not a physical coming in the flesh, as with his first coming, but a second coming in the Spirit, and since then, that coming in the Spirit has come for 2,000 years to all those that turn to Jesus as their Savior. Others instead, believing in a physical second coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh, in order to explain why there was no second coming of Jesus Christ in the 1st century AD, believe that the Matthew chapter 24 generation is not to be understood as a Bible generation of 35-40 years, 70-80 years, 120 years, but more that of an age that began with Jesus' first coming in the 1st century AD to that of that age ending with his second coming with verse 30-31 in an unknown date and unknown generation. Others instead believe that Matthew chapter 24 is a failed prophecy of events, some fulfilled in the 1st century AD, but others, verse 30-31, not only not fulfilled, but with Jesus himself appearing confused on the when of his second coming, placing it in his generation of the 1st century AD generation. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Where Jesus, with that, this generation shall not pass, appears to be speaking of his generation, of his first coming, the 1st century AD generation. Mockers of God, entertained by the fact that after 2,000 years, still no second coming of Jesus Christ, teach that Jesus was just a man, a cult leader that created a cult, and to make sure that his cult would survive after his death, invented a second coming of his that would never come. For others, Jesus was a seer, a medium, and as all seers and mediums, sometimes they guess it right and other times they guess it wrong. As for example, the Second Temple of Jerusalem, destroyed in 70 AD in verse 15. But with his second coming, verse 30-31, that did not come in that same generation as he promised. For others, Jesus is a fraud, the Bible a collection of invented stories, no second coming because there was no first coming. Others believe that there are errors in translation in Matthew chapter 24, or that the chapter is incomplete, in the sense that there are missing verses that could have shed some light on that coming of Jesus in verse 30 and what appears as the rapture in verse 31, in order to explain what is this coming in verses 30 and 31, if it came or not, and under what form was the chapter fulfilled in the 1st century AD. Some preach that the full understanding of Matthew chapter 24 is not for this age, a mystery that will remain a mystery till Jesus' second coming. Only then the chapter would be fully understood. Well, one thing is for sure. 2,000 years have passed and still no second coming of Jesus, and 2,000 years is a long time. So much of a long time that for many this gives more than enough reason to believe that there is no second coming, or that verse 30-31 are to be interpreted to mean something very different from what we read and appear to understand literally. But the problem with Matthew chapter 24 has nothing to do with the chapter, and all to do with this ridiculous claim that Matthew chapter 24 was fulfilled in the later half of the 1st century AD, and that Matthew chapter 24 is none other than the times before, during, and immediately after the siege of Jerusalem in 66-70 AD, plus these ridiculous interpretations to explain why verse 30-31 were not fulfilled in the 1st century AD. Matthew chapter 24 was not fulfilled in the 1st century AD, and since then remained future. But for 2,000 years, Jesus prophesied his second coming, that after 2,000 years still has to come. And if it were to come, why so far into the future? Why the delay? I would not use the word delay. I would use the word withholdeth. Jesus' second coming is being withholdeth. By whom? By them.